Good day, everyone. We are Group 4 and we will be discussing the paper on Philippine agriculture over the years by Habito and Briones. Before we start, here is a brief overview of the topics that we will be tackling. First, we will discuss the overview of the Philippine agriculture over the years paper. And then, we will focus on the production and productivity trends, specifically labor productivity, land productivity, marginal productivity, and cost competitiveness. In the past 6 decades, the Philippine agricultural economy has experienced continuous fluctuations. However, in the 1960s, it has started to experience a constant decline. During this time, the contributions of agriculture in the GDP has fallen below one-third of the totality of the GDP. Up until the 70s, the Philippines has been at par with its agricultural neighbors in the production and exporting of goods. However, as the years progressed into the 80s and the 90s, the Philippines has lagged behind on the technology and advancement of agriculture in order for it to be able to compete at a global level. In the 90s, the Philippines experienced an increase in yield, even though the output and area of crops such as corn and coconut fell. A significant exception to this is the sugarcane. However, these increases have been overturned by the following decade drastically. To have a more in-depth understanding of what the effects of the 2000s were, here are the production and productivity trends.
Okay, so after the overview, we have the category production and productivity trends, and it has four subcategories, namely labor productivity, land productivity, marginal productivity, and cost competitiveness. But let's talk about labor productivity first. Okay, so labor productivity. In general, labor productivity talks about the hourly output of a country's economy. Now, specifically, it charts the amount of real gross domestic product or GDP produced by hourly labor. Now, don't confuse labor productivity with employee productivity, as those two are completely different things. Just remember that labor productivity is simply a measure of an individual worker's output. So you might ask, why is labor productivity so important? Labor productivity is important because it is directly linked to improved standards of living in the form of higher consumption. As an economy's labor productivity grows, it produces more goods and services for the same amount of relative work. This increase in output makes it possible to consume more of the goods and services for an increasingly reasonable price. And the growth in labor productivity is measured by the change in economic output per labor hour over a defined period of time. And it depends on three main factors. You can also think of these three as catalysts for growth: saving and investment in physical capital, new technology, and human capital. All right, now we'll go on to the technical side of labor productivity. So I hope you stay and listen till the end because this might be a little too information overload for some of you. Okay, so before I show you all the graphs, I first want to define GVA, or also known as gross value added. GVA is an economic productivity metric that measures the contribution of a corporate subsidiary, company, or municipality to an economy, producer, sector, or region. GVA is important because it is used to adjust GDP, which is a key indicator of the state of a nation's total economy. Alright, so in this slide, you can see the agricultural GVA and exports growth in years 1970 to 1980. The numbers on the side are in percentage, by the way, and RP stands for Republic of the Philippines. So from 1970s up until 1980s, the Philippines' agricultural performance in terms of both agricultural gross value added and agricultural exports compared well with its neighbors and other Asian countries, that it actually ranked second or third among them. This was mainly due to more favorable agricultural prices caused by high world commodity prices that time, technological change in rice and rapid expansion in new exportable crops, adoption of modern varieties, greater use of fertilizers, and expansion of irrigation in rice increased rice cropping intensity and doubled yields within a span of 15 years. Now, as good as it may seem, during these years, the agricultural GVA and export growth rates declined a decade after. During the years 1980s and 1990, the country had lagged behind most of the countries in the region. And this actually continued on the succeeding years that came, as agricultural output growth had slowed down dramatically as well through the decades. So, why is that? What's with the sudden drop? Well, aside from the fact that the country suffered from the occurrence of El Niño and adverse weather effects, this was also the years the Philippines adopted various structural adjustment and stabilization policies to correct fundamental distortions in the economic incentives and imbalances in the external and public sector accounts, as well as to minimize the potential instability in the process of those reforms. This included trade policy reforms to remove quantitative trade restrictions, lower average and limited dispersion of tariffs, eliminate implicit and explicit taxes on traditional exports, and the list goes on, which had profound direct and indirect effects on the agricultural sector and was said to have created an incentive structure that is significantly biased against agriculture. Imagine, from 15% during the 1970s, it dropped to -5 during the 1980s and went back up to 6% during the 1990s, not even half of the rate during the 1970s. But it's alright. As the year 2000 entered, the GVA in terms of exports growth of the country was almost 14% in rate and placed around to 13% to 14.54% up until year 2010. But it wasn't too long until the rate started dropping again. From 14% during the year 2011, it continually dropped as the years went by and landed on 8.8% last 2019. The reason for the rise in growth rates for GVA during the years 2000 to 2011 was because the Philippines had high production and employment productivity rates that the country was able to continue exporting large volumes of rice, vegetables, fruits, fixed vegetable oils and fats, fish and fish preparations that in terms of global exports, the whole agricultural sector garnered 4.1 billion US dollars alone. While the reason for the continuous drop on the succeeding years was because the Philippines exported lesser volumes of rice through the years because of low production. Like so, the production in sugarcane, mangoes, and coffee also declined greatly, and to top on that, the rice tariffication law was approved and implemented last 2019, which greatly, in a negative manner, affected the local rice farmers. Alright, so for this table, it shows the average annual growth in GVA of major agricultural commodities since 1960. So don't confuse it with the former graphs because those talk about the GVA and exports growth rates. What is clear from the table is that the growth rates of all commodities except for livestock and poultry in years 1970 to 1980 have been slowing down over time. Furthermore, growth rates have been below the population growth rate, implying that the production has not been able to keep up with the increasing population. Erratic and accelerating growth over the past 2 decades is a major concern, as agriculture continues to employ a large bulk of the country's poor. Balisacan 2003 estimates that in 2000, the poverty incidence in agriculture was 46%, the highest among the major sectors with the exception of mining. It also contributed 61.3% to population poverty, far exceeding the next biggest sectors, which is construction at 7.7% and the unemployed at 7.3%. While during the years 2014 to 2018, the growth rates in GVA in agriculture was quite better than the growth rates in GVA for years 1960s to 2000s, except on years 2014 to 2015 where the agricultural sector garnered a lot of negatives in some of its crops. But it was a lot better as the growth rates of the agricultural commodities are higher than the population growth rate of the country. This means that the country can keep up with its increasing population. However, despite these growth rates, the major concern on agriculture decades ago is still a major concern up until now, as the rates of poverty in the agricultural sector was comparatively higher than the employment rates. For example, on year 2015, the poverty incidence was 40.8%, while the employment rate was only 29.19%. That is a really huge gap. For 2018 naman, the poverty incidence was 31.6%, while the employment growth rate was only 24.29%. This is really disturbing because even though we can say that the poverty incidence through the years was decreasing, but so is the employment rates in the sector. Okay, so far we have already tackled the growth rates in exports and agricultural commodities. Now let's talk about labor productivity trends naman. Alright, so from the graphs before, we already know that the employment in agriculture has been stagnant and lower than the poverty incidence, even as overall employment continues to grow at a rate of about 2.4% per year from the 1990s onward. And though agriculture employed 36.4% of the labor force in 2003, this is now much lower than the 44% employed a decade earlier. Now, this exit of employment out of agriculture has helped keep labor productivity in agriculture growing at modest rates, roughly on par with the growth rate in total employment. Despite the mediocre growth of labor productivity, the 1990s actually was a period of mild recovery for the sector, after sharply declining in the 1980s. Okay, so for this one, we don't have a graph because we can see one. But a closer examination reveals that within agriculture, labor productivity has stagnated in the crop subsector. The observed growth during the year 1990 was probably due to increasing productivity in livestock and poultry, where use of improved technologies and increasing scale of production considerably improved production efficiency. Nevertheless, labor productivity in Philippine agriculture compares favorably with other developing countries. During the 1990s, the Philippines' labor productivity remains far ahead of those of large populous countries such as China and India. It is also greater than the neighboring Southeast Asian countries of Vietnam, Indonesia, and even Thailand. However, labor productivity lags behind countries with higher per capita incomes such as Malaysia, Brazil, and Chile. Moreover, some of the low productivity countries have experienced a more rapid labor productivity growth in the 1990s. It may be noted that the low growth rate of labor productivity calculated in US dollars in the 1990s is probably due to the depreciation of the exchange rate, as the Philippines was one of those hit by the currency crisis of the late 1990s. Now, during the years 2002 to 2018, it can be seen that the agricultural sector, in terms of labor productivity, is likewise increasing. This is also because of the improved technologies and farming techniques the country is currently adapting in order to improve the competitive advantage of the agricultural sector. But in terms of agricultural labor productivity growth against our neighboring countries, the Philippines is one of the lowest in the list, primarily because of the continual and rapid innovation of our neighboring countries in their agricultural sector compared to ours.
So let us move on to land productivity. Land productivity refers to the range of efficiency of a specific set of land. So there are two types of ways to measure your productivity of your land. One is through average productivity of the land, and the other one is marginal productivity of land. So average productivity of land is defined as the output obtained from the land divided by the area of that piece of land. The equation is APL equals to the output in quintals over the area of land in hectares. So the second one is the marginal productivity of land, which means in an increase in output obtained from the land due to increase in one unit of land, but the other inputs are kept constant. To add on that, the marginal product of land is the additional output gained from adding another unit of land. So this might apply to a farmer who purchased a field adjacent to her existing property or a factory owner who increases the square footage of her facility. So let us talk about the 10 factors that may affect your land productivity. First is the fertility of land. The productivity of land is determined by its natural qualities and its fertility. A flat and level land is comparatively more productive than an undulating one. The rich soil is more fertile and more productive. However, the agricultural productivity can always be improved by proper extensive use of manure and fertilizers along with the adoption of mechanized methods. So the second one is the proper use of land. The productivity of a land is directly related to its proper utilization. For example, a piece of land that is situated in the heart of the city would be more suitable for construction of a house or a marketplace. If ever this piece of land is put for farming or agricultural use, its productivity will most likely be minimal. So the third one is the location of land. The location of land affects its productivity to a very great extent. For example, the location of land near a market or a bus station will result in economy of transportation charges, and overall productivity from this point of view will naturally be higher. Similarly to the better agricultural productivity, its location near water resources is desirable. The fourth one is improvements done on land by increasing irrigation potential. So permanent improvements done on the land by generating artificial means of irrigation, as an example, is wells, canals, tanks. They help keep the water supply regular and have a positive effect on the productivity of the land. So the fifth one is the ability of the organizer. Land is a passive factor of production, and so it is essential for us to combine it with other factors in the right proportion. So to achieve this optimum productivity, and in order for us to accomplish it, an able organizer is a must. An organizer that can successfully handle and combine the passive and the active factors in the right proportion so as to achieve the greater productivity. The competence and the ability of this organizer will directly affect the productivity of your land. So the sixth one is land ownership laws. The land ownership laws prevailing in a country have a significant influence on the productivity of the land. When a full ownership is conferred, the owner takes more interest in its development. For example, a cultivator possessing full ownership rights on a land does more hard work and it will automatically improve the productivity. But poor farmers work as tenants on the lands of large farmers. Insecurity of tenancy rights may cause eviction of the poor tenancy farmers, which will make them uninterested to improve the land productivity. So the seventh one is the availability of efficient labor. The productivity of the land depends on the availability of efficient labor, as land alone cannot produce anything without the efficient labor. If the labor is very efficient, trained, and very capable to adapt to modern techniques, only then he can make use of the proper Only then he can make the proper use of land. So the eighth factor is the improved techniques of production. New inventions and modern and scientific methods of production, such as using high-yielding varieties of seeds or manure, have actually increased the productivity of land. So for the ninth factor is the availability of the capital. Capital is a fundamental factor that affects the productivity of land. The productivity of land can be maximized with the help of improved seeds, chemical fertilizers, and machines. To fulfill all of these requirements, sufficient capital should be very available. So the tenth factor is government policy. The productivity of land is affected by the government policy regarding agriculture. Agricultural productivity starts increasing when the government adopts to proper agricultural policy and provides required assistance to the farmers. On the other hand, the state's negligence towards agriculture is regarded as one of the main causes of agricultural backwardness. This results into low agricultural productivity. So let us move on to the tables. So for the first table, it is the yield comparison. So the Philippines is third to the last after India in high yield season. It is 34% lower than the highest yielder, Vietnam. The Philippines is lowest in the low yield season. It is 39% lower that of Vietnam. So for the second table is the farm cost comparison. Yield affects unit farm cost. For the high yield season, the Philippines recorded the third highest farm cost of 11.13 pesos per kilogram compared to the Vietnam's 5.14 pesos per kilogram and Thailand's 9.7 pesos per kilogram and India's 9.27 pesos per kilogram. In effect, the Philippines is highly uncompetitive with the rice exports, 116% higher than Vietnam and 23% higher than Thailand. In low yield seasons, the Philippine cost is the second highest after Indonesia. It is, however, 2 times that of Vietnam and 1.6 times higher than Thailand's. So let us now move on to marginal productivity.
Okay, now going on to marginal productivity. I know a lot of you are not familiar with this one, so let's define it first. Marginal productivity or marginal product refers to the extra output, return, or profit yielded per unit by advantages from production inputs. Inputs can include things like labor and raw materials. Basically, it's just the additional amount produced or amount you get when you add one additional unit of a particular factor, such as an additional man-hour of labor. For example, what would you get when you study for an extra hour each day? Probably higher grades, right? Than your usual grades. The additional grades you get for adding an extra hour each day in studying is your marginal productivity. So basically, it's that simple. But let's apply it in economics. When you ask an economist what determines how many units of a product are being produced, they would answer you, well, it depends on the so-called factors of production, such as the factory, capital, equipment, and labor man-hours it takes to create the product. According to the theory of marginal productivity, adding more factors of production allows you to increase the amount produced. So, in economics, please correct me if I'm wrong, a common application of marginal productivity analysis is growth accounting. Abstracting from measurement errors and random shocks, total output growth can be categorized into two things, which is the growth of factors of production and the growth of total factor productivity. So, what is growth of total factor productivity? TFP is an indicator of how efficiently agricultural land, labor, capital, and materials are used to produce a country's crops and livestock. It is calculated as the ratio of total agricultural output to total production inputs. And depending on the framework, the total factor productivity can be broken down into technological change and improvements in production efficiency. In this table, you will see a disaggregated breakdown of productivity growth. So for the Philippines, growth in agricultural output was fairly steady up to the 1970s, then declined sharply, partly due to the slowdown in input growth. However, the decline in TFP growth is also a critical part of the story behind agricultural stagnation. The share of TFP growth was fairly significant up to the 1970s, but then subsequently fell to less than 10%. Meanwhile, for Thailand and Indonesia, overall growth was fairly robust and seems to have been driven to a great extent by large and consistent growth of total factor productivity. For Thailand, EFP accounts for about a third of growth, with the greatest contribution happening in the 1970s. In Indonesia, TFP accounts for over 40% of growth, and in fact reaches near parity with factor growth by 1998. But if we're gonna look into the Philippines more specifically, a greater portion of the growth in the agricultural output in the last 4 decades of Philippine agriculture was mostly attributed to the increasing share of inputs used in the production. This table, this one, shows that output growth mirrors the behavior of the input growth. Somehow, the total factor productivity throughout the period appears to be relatively unstable. TFP displayed decreasing contribution from 1961 to 1973 and started to increase from 1974 and showed increasing contribution to output growth from then on. Upward trend to 1986 and then remained fairly stable from 1987 to 2001. However, from 2002 up to 2005, TFP growth is promising and is depicting an increasing trend. This increasing trend was due to the fact that the affirmation of democracy in the country after the martial law signified a change in leadership, which made it possible for the country to have new policies to improve the state of the Philippine economy. Like so, a major innovation on the policies in agriculture also catalyzed the continuous increase. Programs like CARP are also known as Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program, which aim to help the landless farmers and farm workers have the right to own the land they till, or to receive a fair share of the fruits of their labor, became a major catalyst for growth. There are actually more factors that influence the growth of TFP in the agricultural sector of the country, but this is one of them.
So let's talk about cost competitiveness. Cost competitiveness is the selling of a product or service on a much cheaper price compared to the similar products or services offered. So now you know the meaning of cost competitive is, we can now start with the cost competitiveness analysis from the export trade scenario during 2013 of the Philippine cassava. So the Philippine cassava was generally cost competitive for export. The reason for this is the export competitiveness was due to low cost of production and high yield in the different top producing provinces. The border price used is based from Thailand, which is the top exporter of the cassava in Asia. So that concludes our presentation. Thank you for listening, and here are the references.